Lecture 5, Registers, Genres, Styles. Take a minute to think about all the different kinds of texts that you encounter over the course of a normal day. In the morning, maybe you have a conversation with a roommate. As you have breakfast, you might listen to a radio announcer or read the morning newspaper. Then, you might make a phone call to a friend or a family member. As you get ready for a class, you might proofread a paper that is due that day or look over the reading and date for homework. When you attend the class, you probably talk with friends, listen to a lecture and write notes. You constantly deal with text varieties, registers, genres and styles. We use the terms register, genre and style to refer to three different perspectives on text varieties. The register perspective combines an analysis of linguistic characteristics that are common in a text variety with analysis of the situation of use of the variety. The underlying assumption of the register perspective is that core linguistic features like pronouns and verbs are functional, and as a result, particular features are commonly used in association with the communicative purposes and situational context of the text. The genre perspective is similar to the register perspective in that it includes description of the purposes and situational context of a text variety, but its linguistic analysis contrasts with the register perspective by focusing on the conventional structures used to construct a complete text within the variety. For example, the conversational way in which a letter begins and ends. The style perspective is similar to the register perspective in its linguistic focus, analyzing the use of core linguistic features that are distributed throughout text samples from a variety. The key difference from the register perspective is that the use of these features is not functionally motivated by the situational context. Rather, style features reflect aesthetic preferences associated with particular authors or historical periods. In general terms, a register is a variety associated with a particular situation of use, including particular communicative purposes. The description of a register covers three major components: the situational context, the linguistic features, and the functional relationships between the two components. Registers are described for their typical lexical and grammatical characteristics, their linguistic features. But registers are also described for their situational contexts, for example, whether they are produced in speech or writing, whether they are interactive, and what their primary communicative purposes are. According to the point of view of Douglas Bieber and Susan Conrado, linguistic features are always functional when considered from a register perspective. That is, linguistic features tend to occur in a register because they are particularly well suited to the purposes and situational context of the register. Thus, the third component of any register description is the functional analysis. Registers can be identified and described based on analysis of either complete texts or a collection of text excerpts. This is because the linguistic component of a register analysis requires identification of the pervasive linguistic features in the variety, linguistic characteristics that might occur in and any variety but are much more common in the target register. It is these pervasive linguistic features that are clearly functional. Situational varieties can also be described by analyzing language features that characterize complete texts, referred to as the genre perspective. Genre features are not pervasive. Rather, they might occur only one time in a complete text, often at the beginning or ending boundary. They are also often conventional rather than functional. For a simple example of the register analysis process, briefly consider face-to-face conversation. First of all, it is important to note the situational characteristics of conversation that distinguish it from other registers. Face-to-face conversation requires direct interaction between at least two people who are together in the same place at the same time. Both participants must speak or the conversation would become a monologue. Furthermore, while many specific topics and purposes are possible, it is generally appropriate for participants to discuss events, thoughts, and opinions related to their personal lives or something in the intermediate context. The second step is to describe the typical, pervasive linguistic features of conversation. This step requires consideration of multiple texts from the target register to discover the linguistic features that are frequent across texts and not characteristic of only a single text. Previous register studies have found 3 linguistic features, among many others, to be more common in conversation than in many other registers. First-person pronouns I and we, second-person pronouns you, and questions. Finally, the third step of register analysis is to interpret the relationship between situational characteristics and pervasive linguistic features in functional terms. Register characteristics become more salient if any analysis contrasts two different registers. For example, in contrast to the speakers in a conversation, the author of a front-page newspaper article is not addressing a specific person, and there is no direct interaction between a specific reader and the author. It is also not normally relevant for the author to describe her own personal feelings or other aspects of her personal life. As a result of these functional considerations, there are many normally few first and second person pronouns and questions in front page newspaper articles. These differences illustrate a key aspect of register, namely, the characteristics of an individual register become much more apparent when it is compared to other registers. Talking about registers, the following aspects should be pointed out. Firstly, the situational characteristics of registers are more basic than the linguistic features. Registers differ in both their situational and linguistic characteristics. However, the situational characteristics are more basic. All speakers use language in different contexts, under different circumstances for different purposes. Those patterns of behavior cannot be derived from any linguistic phenomena. In contrast, the linguistic differences among registers can be derived from situational differences because linguistic features are functional. For example, imagine that what it would be like if the linguistic considerations were primary. In that case, you might be sitting at your computer and suddenly feel like producing a text with lots of pronouns I and you and lots of questions, and only later realize that such a text must occur in a conversational context, so you would go around looking for someone to have a conversation with. Obviously, this is not how communication works. Rather, you find yourself in a conversational situation, and because of that, you start to produce language with the linguistic features that are appropriate for a conversation. Second, registers differ in their characteristic distributions of pervasive linguistic features, not the single occurrence of an individual feature. It is important to note that very few registers can be identified by unique lexical or grammatical features. Instead, to carry out the linguistic analysis of a register, you must consider the extent to which linguistic features are used in order to identify the linguistic features that are pervasive and especially common in the target register. For example, it is not the case that conversation always uses pronouns and never only nouns, or that newspaper writing always uses nouns and never use any pronouns. Instead, both registers use both nouns and pronouns. However, conversation uses more pronouns and fewer nouns, while newspaper writing uses more nouns and fewer pronouns. In other words, the relative distribution of nouns and pronouns differs greatly between conversation and newspaper writing. The linguistic analysis of registers is based on such differences in the relative distribution of linguistic features, which are especially common and pervasive in some registers but comparatively rare in the other registers. Third, register analysis requires both situational and linguistic analysis, often applied cyclically. In a register analysis, both the situational components and the linguistic features are explicitly described. The functional interpretation, then, is based on comparison of the situational and linguistic analysis. New register studies usually begin with at least some analysis of the situational characteristics. Initial analysis of the situational characteristics can be important for selecting appropriate text samples to include in a study. However, often in register analysis, you will find that there are surprises resulting from the linguistic analysis. Certain linguistic features will occur more frequently or rarely than you expect. These unexpected linguistic patterns will often require that you reassess the situational characteristics of the register, especially with respect to less obvious characteristics like the communicative purpose. Thus, the process of register analysis is often iterative. Fourth, register variation has a functional basis. The linguistic differences among registers are not arbitrary. For example, it is not sufficient to merely note that the language of conversation has many second-person pronouns and questions because it is an accepted convention to use these features in conversation. Rather, register analysis always includes description of the situational context and interpretation of why particular linguistic features commonly occur in that context. The functional associations between linguistic patterns and situational factors are at the heart of the studying register variations. The fifth, registers can be identified on different levels of specificity. A register can be extremely general, like textbooks, but what about textbooks in linguistics? Graduate-level textbooks in sociolinguistics. In fact, any of these can be identified at a register. There is no one correct level on which to identify a register. Rather, it depends on the goal of your study. You may want to characterize the register of academic prose, a very general register, or you may be interested in only research articles, a more specific register within academic prose. Or you might focus on medical research articles, or even only the method sections of the experimental medical research articles. All of these can be considered registers, differing in their level of generality. As a register category becomes more specific, it is possible to identify its situational and linguistic characteristics more precisely. The sixth, register analysis must be based on a representative sample of texts. Because a register analysis seeks to characterize a variety of language, not a particular text or an individual writer's style, it must be based on analysis of a sample of texts selected to represent the register as fully as possible. It should be mentioned that many intriguing results can come from small register analysis. However, you should always remember that you cannot generalize to a register from an analysis with a small number of texts unless you have supporting evidence from larger scale studies. Following the ideas of Douglas Beaver and Susan Conrado, we regard genre, register, and style as different approaches or perspectives for analyzing text varieties, not as different kinds of texts or different varieties. In fact, the same text can be analyzed from register, genre, and style perspectives. Different patterns of texture are associated with different types of texts. Newspaper articles, for example, tend to favor particular kinds of cohesive devices and are structured in a conventional way, with a summary of the main points in the beginning and with the details coming later. To understand why such textual conventions are associated with this type of text, however, we need to understand something about the people who produce and consume it and what they are doing with it. The study of the social functions of different kinds of texts is called genre analysis. The notion genre is probably familiar to you from your experience as a moviegoer. Different films belong to different genres. There are westerns, love stories, horror films, thrillers, chick films, and many other film genres. Before we go to the movies, we always have some idea about the film we're about to see based on the genre that it belongs to. These expectations include not just ideas about the kind of story the film will tell and the kinds of characters it will include, but also ideas about things like cinematography, lighting, special effects, and other filming techniques. At the same time, of course, not all films fit neatly into genres. We might go to a film called Scary Movie and find that it is actually a comedy, or we might expect a film like Brokeback Mountain, whose poster portrays cowboys, to be a western, only to find that it is also a love story. In fact, one thing that makes such films so successful is that they creatively compound our expectations by mixing different genres together. The notion of genre and discourse analysis goes beyond examining the conventional structures and features of different kinds of texts to asking what these structures and features can tell us about the people who use the texts and what they are using them to do. In his book Analyzing Genre, Vijay Bhatia, drawing on the work of John Swales, defines genre as follows. A genre is a recognizable communicative event characterized by a set of communicative purposes, identified and mutually understood by members of the community in which it occurs. Most often, it is highly structured and conventionalized with constraints on allowable contributions in terms of their intent, positioning, form, and functional value. These constraints, however, are often exploited by expert members of the discourse community to achieve private intentions within the framework of the socially recognized purposes. There are three important aspects to this definition that need to be further explained. First, that genres are not defined as types of texts, but rather as types of communicative events. Second, that these events are characterized by constraints on what can be and cannot be done within them. And third, that expert users often exploit these constraints in creative and unexpected ways. Genres as communicative events. While it might not seem unusual to refer to spoken genres like conversations and debates and political speeches as events, thinking of written texts like newspaper articles, recipes and job applications, letters as events might at first seem rather strange. We are in many ways accustomed to thinking of texts as objects, seeing them as events. However, highlights the fact that all texts are basically instances of people doing things with or to other people. A newspaper article is an instance of someone informing someone else about some recent event. A recipe is an instance of someone instructing another person how to prepare a particular kind of food. And a job application letter is an instance of someone requesting that another person give him or her a job. As Martin points out, genres are how things get done when language is used to accomplish them. Thus, the ways different kinds of texts are put together is inseparable from the things the text is trying to get done in a particular historical, cultural, and social context. Of course, most texts are not just trying to get only one thing done. The communicative purposes of texts are often multiple and complex. A recipe, for example, may be persuading you to make a certain dish or to buy a certain product with which to make it, as much as it is instructing you how to do it. And a newspaper article might be attempting not just to inform you about a particular event, but also to somehow affect your opinion about it. The different people using the text might also have different purposes in mind. While a job applicant sees his or her application letter as a way to convince a prospective employer to hire him or her, the employer might see the very same application letter as a means of weeding out unsuitable candidates. Conventions and constraints. Because genres are about getting things done, the way they are structured and the kinds of features they contain are largely determined by what people want to do with them. The kinds of information I might include in a job application, for example, would be designed to convince a prospective employer that I am the right person for the job. This information would probably not include my recipe for chocolate brownies or my opinion about some event I read about in a newspaper. Genre, therefore, comes with built-in constraints as to what kinds of things they can include and what kinds of things they cannot, based on the activity they are trying to accomplish. These constraints govern not just what can be included, but also how it should be included. In my job application letter, for example, I would probably want to present the information in a certain order, beginning by indicating the post I am applying for, and then going on to describe my qualifications and experience, and ending by requesting an appointment for an interview. Putting this information in a different order, for example, waiting until the end of the letter to indicate the post for which I am applying, would be considered odd. The order in which I do things in a genre, what is a genre analysis is called the move structure of a particular genre, often determines how successfully I am able to fulfill the communicative purpose of the genre. Stating which post I am applying for at the beginning of my job application letter is a more efficient way of introducing the letter because it helps to create a framework for the information that comes later. But what is important about these conventions and constraints is not just that they make communicative events more efficient, but also that they demonstrate that the person who produced the text knows how we do things. Prospective employers read application letters not just to find out what post an applicant is applying for and what qualifications or experience that person has, but also to find out if that person knows how to write a job application letter. In other words, the ability to successfully produce this type of genre following particular conventions is taken as an indication that the writer is a certain kind of person with a certain level of education who knows how to communicate like us. In fact, for some employers, the qualifications that applicants demonstrate through successfully producing the genre are far more important than those they describe in the letter itself. Creativity. That is not to say that all job application letters or other genres like newspaper articles and recipes are always exactly the same, as the directors of the hybrid films described above can tell us often the most successful texts are those which break the rules defy conventions and push the boundaries of constraints. Expert producers of texts, for example, sometimes mix different kinds of text together, or embedded one genre into another, or alter in some way the moves that are included or the order in which they are presented. Of course, there are limitations to how much a genre can be altered and still be successful at accomplishing what its producers want to accomplish. There are always risks associated with being creative. There are several important points to be made here. The first is that such creativity would not be possible without the existence of conventions and constraints, and the reason innovations can be effective is that they play off or exploit previously formed expectations. The second is that such creativity must itself have some relationship to the communicative purpose of the genre and the context in which it is used. Writing a job application letter in the form of a sonnet, for example, may be more effective if I want to get a job as an editor at the literary magazine than if I want to get a job as a software engineer. Finally, being able to successfully bend and blend genres is very much a matter of and a marker of expertise. In order to break the rules effectively, you must also be able to show that you have mastered the rules. Discourse communities. It should be clear by now that at the center of the concept of genre is the idea of belonging. We produce and use genres not just in order to get things done, but also to show ourselves to be members of particular groups and to demonstrate that we are qualified and participate in particular activities. Genres are always associated with certain groups of people that have certain common goals and common ways of reaching these goals. Doctors use medical charts and prescriptions to do the job of curing people. Solicitors use contracts and legal briefs to defend people's rights. These different genres not only help the people in these groups get certain things done, they also help to define these groups, to keep out people who do not belong in them, and to regulate the relationships between the people who do belong. John Swales calls these groups discourse communities. In his book, Genre Analysis, he describes a number of features that define discourse communities, among which are that they consist of expert members whose job is to socialize new members into how things are done, that members have ways of regularly communicating with and providing feedback to one another, and that members tend to share a certain vocabulary or jargon. The two most important characteristics of discourse communities are that members have common goals and common means of reaching those goals, genres. These goals and the means of reaching them work to reinforce each other. Every time a member makes use of a particular genre, he or she not only moves the group closer to the shared goals, but also validates these goals as worthy and legitimate and shows him or herself to be a worthy and legitimate member of the group. Thus, genres not only link people together, they also link people with certain activities, identities, roles, responsibilities. In a very real way, then, genres help to regulate and control what people do and who people can be in various contexts. This regulation and control is exercised in a number of ways. First of all, since the goals of the community and the ways these goals are to be accomplished are built in to the texts that members of a discourse community use on a daily basis, it becomes much more difficult to question those goals. Since mastery of the genre is a requirement for membership, members must also buy in to the goals of the community. Finally, since texts always create certain kinds of relationships between those who have produced them and those who are using them, when the conventions and constraints associated with texts become fixed and difficult to change, these roles and relationships also become fixed and difficult to change. When we looked at it in this way, genres are not just text types that are structured in certain ways and contain certain linguistic features. They are important tools through which people, groups, and institutions define, organize, and structure social reality. Defining characteristics of registers, genres, and styles. As shown in the table, the three perspectives differ in four major ways with respect to: first, the texts considered for the analysis, the linguistic characteristics considered for the analysis, the distribution of those linguistic characteristics, and the interpretation of linguistic differences. In the genre perspective, the focus is on the linguistic characteristics that are used to structure complete texts, while in both the register perspective and the style perspective, the focus is on the pervasive linguistic characteristics of representative text excerpts from the variety. As summarized in the table, the register perspective characterizes the typical linguistic features of text varieties and connects those features functionally to the situational context of the variety. Because the focus is on words and grammatical features that are frequent and pervasive, the analysis can be based on a sample of text excerpts rather than complete texts. In contrast to the focus of the register perspective, the genre perspective usually focuses on language characteristics that occur only once in a text. These features serve a crucial role in how texts from a particular variety are constructed. For this reason, genre studies must be based on analysis of complete texts from the variety. These language features are conventionally associated with the genre. They conform to the culturally expected way of constructing texts belonging to the variety. For example, a genre study of business letters would analyze the expected textual conventions for complete letters. These conventions include the expectations that the letter will begin with the date at the top, followed by the name and address of the recipient, followed by a salutation and a title, for example, Dear Mr. Smith, followed by the main body of the letter. The letter will then close with some kind of politeness expression, for example, yours faithfully, followed by the signature of the letter writer. These conventions are part of what defines a letter, and they can be identified only by considering complete letters. The genre perspective often focuses on the rhetorical organization of texts from a variety, especially the rhetorical conventions of written varieties. For example, by convention, a front-page newspaper story begins with the concise title and the name of the place where the story occurred. The prose text opens with one or two sentences that summarize the main event that has occurred and the significance of that event. The text then has multiple paragraphs, each describing some aspect of the story: how the event came about, the background of the main participants, direct and indirect quotations, how other participants became involved, consequences of the event, and so on. These paragraphs are usually very short and self-contained. The register and genre perspectives differ in the extent to which they can be applied. Complete texts are required to identify the linguistic characteristics associated with the genre perspective. Text excerpts are not adequate for genre analysis because they do not necessarily represent the linguistic conventions that define the genre, e.g., the conventional ways to begin or end a text. In contrast, any text sample can be analyzed from a register perspective, considering the typical linguistic features associated with the situational context. These linguistic features occur throughout texts, from a register, and so complete texts are not required to analyze register characteristics. Complete texts that are analyzed from a genre perspective can also be analyzed from a register perspective. Finally, the style perspective is similar to the register perspective in that it considers the typical linguistic features associated with the collection of text samples from a variety. The two perspectives differ in their interpretation, that is, in the underlying reasons for the observed linguistic patterns. The systematic linguistic patterns associated with the register perspective exist because linguistic variation is functional. Linguistic features are used frequently in a register when they are required by the situational characteristics of a register. In contrast, the linguistic patterns associated with styles are not functional. Rather, these are features associated with aesthetic preferences, influenced by the attitudes of the speaker-writer about language. That is, a speaker or author often has attitudes about what constitutes good style, resulting in the manipulation of language for aesthetic purposes. Styles are normally distinguished from the texts within a register or genre. The most common application of this concept is to describe systematic variation within the register genre of fiction. However, a similar notion of style has been used to study variation within the register of conversation, where each subculture can be described as having a distinctive communicative style or conversational style, meaning that they have different forms for how they usually structure a conversation, relating to different speech rates, different pauses lengths between turns, whether overlapping speech is considered to be polite or not, and so on. Particular fictional styles are often associated with individual authors. For example, authors like Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison preferred a fictional style with extreme long complex sentences, mixed in with the short single clause sentences. In contrast, an author like Ernest Hemingway preferred a style with consistently short simple sentences. But styles can also be associated with different groups of authors or different historical periods. As it was mentioned, the same text and all varieties can be considered from register, genre, and style perspectives. For example, a genre perspective or on scientific research articles would describe the conventional rhetorical structure of complete articles, how they begin with the title, the author's name, and an abstract, followed by the introduction, methods section, results, discussion, conclusion, and then concluding with a bibliography. However, these same scientific research articles can be studied from a register perspective, identifying the core linguistic features that are pervasive in this kind of writing. For example, long noun phrases, nominalizations, passive verbs, and explaining the preference of those linguistic features in functional terms by reference to the production circumstances of writing and the typical communicative purposes of research articles. And the same texts can be studied from a style perspective, identifying the linguistic features associated with a particular author or a particular historical period, in association with notions of good writing or prose that is authentically pleasing. Register genre variation as linguistic universal. All cultures use language for different communicative purposes in different situations. Register variation focuses on the pervasive patterns of linguistic variation across such situations in association with functions sought by linguistic features. Genre variation focuses on the conventional ways in which complete texts of different types are structured. Taken together, register genre variation is a fundamental aspect of human language. All cultures and languages have an array of register genres, and all humans control a range of registers genres. The universal nature of register genre variation has been noted by many previous scholars. For example, Ferguson said, register variation, in which language structure varies in accordance with the occasions of use, is all-pervasive in human language. Hymes mentioned, no human being talks the same way all the time. At the very least, a variety of registers and style is used and encountered. Urey mentioned, each language community has its own system of registers, corresponding to the range of activities in which its members normally engage. Given the ubiquity of register, genre, variation, and understanding of how linguistic features are used in patterned way across text varieties is of central importance for both the description of a particular languages and the development of cross-linguistic theories of language use. Hymes argues that the analysis of register, genre, variation, verbal repertoire, in his terms, should become the major focus of research within linguistics. The social linguistic perspective has the possibility of taking the lead in transforming the study of language through developing and consolidating the systematic study of verbal repertoire. The abilities of individuals and the composite abilities of communities cannot be understood except by making verbal repertoire, not language, the central scientific notion. That was mentioned by Hymes. Although all societies and languages have a number of registers, genres, they do not necessarily have equivalent sets. For example, some languages societies have only spoken register genres. In such cases, there might be individual speakers who are capable of producing language in all register genres of the language. In contrast, modern literate societies incorporate a much larger set of spoken and written text varieties. As a result, no individual speaker-writer can control the full set of text varieties found in the culture. Previous studies have documented these differences, noting that historical change in the system of text varieties in a language is fundamentally important. For example, Urey pointed out the register range of a language is one of the most immediate ways in which it responds to social change. The difference between developed and undeveloped languages, Ferguson 1968, is fundamentally one of register range and language contrast and language contact, which contributes to language development. It mediated by particular registers. This issue is concerned with both the pressures that make for change and the way in which these changes are realized linguistically. One of the two main tasks requiring attention within social linguistics at present is the description and analysis of the organization and change of verbal repertoires in relation to the main processes of societal evolution of our time. This is what Hymes said. So, register genre variations are universal because all cultures use language in different situations for different communicative purposes.